read an excerpt from my memoir, Wild, and it's really about the summer that I was 26 in 1995, when my life had sort of reached what I think of as the bottom. A lot of really hard things had happened, and I decided that I needed to do something to go back to really being the person that I knew I was. And so I decided to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, which probably many of you know, it's a wilderness trail that goes from Mexico to Canada, through California, Oregon, and Washington, really up the sort of crest line of the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Range. And I didn't have time to hike, I didn't have the time or the money really to hike the whole thing. But I went out there and I hiked for about 100 days by myself. I started in the Mojave Desert and I walked to the Columbia River, which is the borderline between Washington and Oregon. And it was a really long and crazy journey, especially because I had never gone backpacking, even for one night, you know, before I began. And so, you know, I had always been a sort of go-getter, ambitious kind of girl, and I just sort of got this idea that this would be the thing to do. And of course, once I got out there, I realized that that my idea was, you know, very different from what reality was. And so it was really an incredibly hard thing. And it was hard in a different way than my life had been hard up until that point. In my early 20s, my mom had died suddenly. And I really, in my grief, I didn't know how I was going to live. I didn't know how I was going to go on. And so Wild is really this sort of wilderness adventure tale of the trip, but it's also about everything that happened before that and what brought me out there. So I'm going to read you a passage from, at this point I've been out on the trail about 8 days, and I'm in the Mojave Desert, and I haven't seen another human being the entire time, the entire first 8 days. And also I started in this very dry stretch of the trail where there's absolutely no water, and so I had to carry, you know, like 30 pounds of water, in addition to about 70 pounds of other shit that I brought with me because I didn't know what I was doing. And I could not, I mean, it was, you know, if you read the book, you'll see really how heavy my pack was, which was just absolutely, you know, absurd, the things I had in it. And so the things you need to know is, 2 nights before I began hiking the trail, I hooked up with this ex-boyfriend of mine in Portland, and we ended up shooting heroin. It was the last time I shot heroin. And so in this passage, I'll refer to this bruise that I got from shooting. And also, I had just gotten divorced 2 months before. My husband, Paul, is mentioned in this passage. Oh, and the day before, so the day before this passage, 2 things happened. One, I was walking down the trail, and I looked up, you know, from this hunched position, because I couldn't actually stand up, and I saw this large, brown, horned beast running at me. And I had grown up in northern Minnesota, and you know, when a very large beast with horns is running at you in the wilderness, like it's hard to think fast. And so I couldn't figure out like what this thing was. I just knew that it was about to kill me. And so I started just screaming, "Moose, moose," even though I knew it couldn't be a moose in the Mojave Desert. And it turned out it was a feral Texas longhorn bull. And I was encroaching on its territory. Apparently, I learned later, some of these bulls go feral because the cowboys don't get them back. And so this was this bull. And I was injured by the bull. And also, I had put the wrong kind of gas in my backpacking stove. And so for 8 days, I couldn't cook any of the dehydrated food that I had with me. So I had run out of like all the nuts and the bars. And I realized I had to get off the trail because I was going to starve to death if I stayed. I had to walk like another 100 miles before I would get to a place where my resupply box was waiting. So I decided in this passage, I came across this Jeep road that went east. And I knew that about 20 miles east there was a highway. And I thought, if I just walk down this road, maybe something good will happen. Okay. I walked, not knowing what road I was on, going only on faith that I would find something. I walked in the bright hot sun. I could smell myself as I moved. I hadn't bathed in over a week. My body was covered with dirt and blood, my hair dense with dust and dried sweat, plastered to my head beneath my hat. I could feel the muscles in my body growing stronger by the day, and at the same time, in equal measure, my tendons and joints breaking down. My feet hurt both inside and out, their flesh rubbed raw with blisters, their bones and muscles fatigued from the miles. For long stretches, I tried to imagine that I didn't actually have feet, that instead my legs ended in two impervious stumps that couldn't endure anything. After 4 hours, I began to regret my decision. I might starve to death out there or be killed by marauding longhorn bulls, but on the PCT, at least I knew where I was. I reread my guidebook, uncertain by now if I was even on one of the roads they described in a cursory way. I took out my map and compass every hour to assess and reassess my position. I pulled out the book Staying Found to read again how exactly to use a map and compass. I studied the sun. I passed a small herd of cows that were unbound by a fence, and my heart leapt at the sight of them, though none moved in my direction. They only stopped eating to lift their heads and watch me pass, while I delicately chanted to them, "Cow, cow, cow." The land through which the road passed was surprisingly green in places, dry and rocky in others, and twice I passed tractors parked silent and eerie by the side of the road. I walked in a state of wonder at the beauty and the silence, but by late afternoon apprehension rose in my throat. I was on a road, but I had not seen a human being in 8 days. This was civilization, and yet, aside from the free-range cows and the 2 abandoned tractors and the road itself, there was no sign of it. I felt like I was starring in a science fiction film, like I was the only person left on the planet, and for the first time in my journey, I thought I might cry. I took a deep breath to push away my tears and took off my pack and set it in the dirt to regroup. There was a bend in the road ahead, and I walked around it without my pack to see what I could. What I saw were 3 men sitting in the cab of a yellow pickup truck. One was white, one was black, one was Latino. It took perhaps 60 seconds for me to reach them on foot. They watched me with the same expression on their faces as I'd had when I'd seen the longhorn bull the day before. Like any moment they might yell, "Moose!" My relief at the sight of them was enormous. Yet as I strode toward them, my whole body tingled with the complicated knowledge that I was no longer the sole star in a film about a planet devoid of people. Now I was in a different kind of movie. I was the sole woman with 3 men of unknown intent, character, and origin watching me from the shade of the yellow truck. When I explained my situation to them through the open driver's side window, they gazed at me silently, their eyes shifting from startled to stunned to scoffing until they all burst out in laughter. "Do you know what you walked into, honey?" the white man asked me when he'd recovered, and I shook my head. He and the black man looked to be in their 60s, the Latino barely out of his teens. "You see this here mountain?" he asked. He pointed straight ahead through the windshield from his position behind the wheel. "We're getting ready to blow that mountain up." He explained to me that a mining operation had bought rights to this patch of land, and they were mining for decorative rocks that people put in their yards. "My name's Frank," he said, tapping the brim of his cowboy hat. "And technically, you're trespassing, young lady, but we won't hold that against you." He looked at me and winked. "We're just miners. We don't own the land. If we did, we'd shoot you." He laughed again and then gestured to the Latino in the middle and told me his name was Carlos. "I'm Walter," said the black man, sitting in by the passenger window. They were the first people I'd seen in 8 days. When I spoke, my voice sounded funny, seemed to be higher and faster than I'd remembered, as if it was something I couldn't quite catch and hold on to, as if every word was a small bird fluttering away. They told me to get in the back of the truck, and we drove the short distance around the bend to retrieve my pack. Frank stopped, and they all got out. Walter picked up my pack and was shocked by the weight. "I was in Korea," he said, hoisting it onto the truck's metal bed with considerable effort. "And we ain't never carried a pack like that." Or maybe one time I carried one that heavy, but it was when I was being punished. Quickly, without my being involved, it was decided I'd go home with Frank, where his wife would feed me dinner, and I could bathe and sleep in a bed. In the morning, he'd help me get someplace where someone would fix my stove. Now, explain all this to me again, Frank asked a few times, and each time all three of them listened with confused and rapt attention. They lived perhaps 20 miles from the Pacific Crest Trail, and yet none of them had ever heard of it. None could fathom what business a woman had hiking it by herself, and Frank and Walter told me so in jovial, gentlemanly terms. I think it's kind of cool, said Carlos. He was 18, just about to join the military. Maybe you should do this instead, I said, but he only shook his head. The men got into the truck again, and I rode in the back for a couple of miles by myself until we reached a spot where Walter had parked his truck. He and Carlos drove off in it and left me alone with Frank, who had an hour more of work to do. I sat in the cab of his yellow truck, watching Frank go back and forth on a tractor grading the road. Each time he passed, he waved to me, and as he rode away, I surreptitiously explored the contents of his truck. In the glove compartment, there was a silver flask of whiskey. I took a shallow swig and quickly put it back, my mouth on fire. I reached under the seat and pulled out a slim black case and opened it up and saw a gun as silver as the whiskey glass, and shut it again and shoved it beneath the seat. The keys to the truck dangled from the ignition, and I thought idly about what would happen if I started it up and drove away. I took off my boots and massaged my feet. The little bruise on my ankle that I'd gotten from shooting heroin in Portland was still there, but faded to a faint morose yellow. I ran my finger over the bump of the tiny track mark still detectable at its core, amazed at my own ludicrousness, then put my socks back on so I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. What kind of woman are you? Frank asked when he was done with his work and he'd climbed into the truck beside me. I'm sorry. What kind? I asked. Our eyes locked and something in his unveiled itself, and I looked away. Are you like Jane? Like the kind of woman Tarzan would like? I guess so, I said, and laughed, though I felt a creeping anxiety, wishing that Frank would start the truck and drive. He was a big man, rangy and chiseled and tan, a miner who looked to me like a cowboy. His hands reminded me of all the hands of the men I'd known growing up, men who worked their bodies for a living, men whose hands would never get clean no matter how hard they scrubbed. And as I sat there with him, I felt the way I always do when alone in certain circumstances with certain men, that anything could happen. That he could go about his business mannerly and kind, or he could grab me and change the course of things entirely. With Frank in his truck, I watched his hands, his every move, each cell in my body on high alert, though I appeared as relaxed as if I'd just woken from a nap. I've got a little something for us, he said. He reached into the glove compartment to remove the flask of whiskey. It's my reward for a hard day's work. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to me. Ladies first. I took it from him and held it to my lips and let the whiskey run into my mouth. Yep, that's the kind of woman you are. That's what I'm going to call you, Jane. He took the flask from me and had a long drink. You know, I'm not actually out here completely alone, I said. My husband, his name is Paul. He's also hiking. He started up in Kennedy Meadows. Do you know where that is? We each wanted the experience of hiking alone. So he's hiking south and I'm hiking north, and we're going to meet in the middle and then go the rest of the summer together. Frank nodded and took another sip from the flask. Well, then he's crazier than you, he said, after thinking about it. It's one thing to be a woman crazy enough to do what you're doing, another thing to be a man who let his wife go off and do it. Yeah, I said, as if I agreed with him. So anyway, we'll be reunited in a few days. I said it with such conviction that I felt convinced of it myself, that Paul that very minute was making his way toward me. But in fact, I hadn't signed the papers that finalized our divorce 2 months before on a snowy day in April. That he was coming for me, or that he would know if I didn't make it any further, that my disappearance would be noted. But the opposite was true. The people in my life were like the Band-Aids that had blown away in the desert that first day on the trail. They scattered and were gone. No one expected me even so much as to call when I reached my first stop, or my second, or third. Frank leaned back against his seat and adjusted his big metal belt buckle. There's something else I like to reward myself with after a hard day's work, he said. What's that? I asked, a tentative smile, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands on my lap felt both tingly and numb. I was acutely aware of my backpack too far away in the bed of his truck. In a flash, I knew I'd leave it behind if I had to push the truck door open and run. Frank reached under the seat where the gun resided in its little black case. He came up with a clear plastic bag. Inside, there were long, thin ropes of red licorice, each bunch wound like a lasso. He held the bag out to me and asked, "You want some, Miss Jane?"